To better understand the present-day makeup of the prairie regions, we must explore their history. During the Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous periods, the continents were geologically active with platonic shifting and huge shallow seas formed across North America, as you can see in these slides. The seas advanced and retreated many times, depositing numerous layers of limestone, chalk, shale, and sand. You can find excellent fossils of marine organisms in many of these areas today. The major grassland areas of North America can be classified as the tall grass prairie, mixed grass prairie, and the short grass prairie. The vegetation heights corresponds to the annual precipitation amounts, with higher precipitation on the easterly edge and decreasing as you go westward. The tallgrass prairie once covered over 142 million acres in North America, estimated to have lost between 88 to 99%. This decline is greater than any other ecosystem in North America. The largest remaining intact prairie is the Flint Hills region of Kansas and northern Oklahoma. This area is approximately 5 million acres. This area is hilly with shallow, rocky soils not suitable for farming, so it has mainly been used for grazing. The Flint Hills region is the dark green area in Kansas on this map. Here you will see several quotes by some of our early Americans. In the early 1800s, the public perception of the prairies was that these areas were wastelands and that the Great Plains were referred to as the Great American Desert. These reports were strongly influenced by reports filtering back from the Corps of Discovery expedition led by Lewis and Clark from 1804 to 1806, as well as other early explorers. The perception at this time was that the areas were void of trees, was uninhabitable, and were considered deserts regardless of annual precipitation. Audubon, as many of you may know, was an early American ornithologist, naturalist, and painter. Rufus Sage was an American writer who also became a mountain man during the 1800s. Then Major Stephen Long was a government surveyor and expedition leader. An article by Jill Hawkes, who is the education director on the Konza Prairie in Kansas, noted the irony of 400,000 people who traveled over the plains on the Oregon Trail between 1846 and 1869 with the intention of finding good farmland in Oregon, while traveling over the most fertile farmland in the world to get to an agriculturally inferior destination. And closer to home, the Blackland Prairie in Texas is part of the tallgrass prairie system that extends north to the Great Plains. This prairie consists of two segments, the San Antonio Prairie and the Fayette Prairie. Both combined historically covered approximately 11.5 million acres in Texas. Today, less than 1% remain. When speaking of prairies in Texas, you cannot forget about the coastal prairie ecosystem. On the upland sites, many of the same dominant grasses in this system were the same as the Great Plains prairies, with little blue stem, big blue, Indian grass, switchgrass, and eastern gamma grass being dominant. These prairies do have very different hydrology than the Great Plains, though, and often have wetland communities interspersed through the prairies, and historically appeared much like a sponge, with many potholes and uplands interspersed with only inches difference in elevation. Historically, the coastal prairie in Texas encompassed approximately 6.5 million acres, while the Cajun prairie was approximately 2.5 million acres. Now less than 0.1% remains relatively undisturbed. This is an aerial photo from 1944 taken just south of Cypress. Notice the spongy appearance with the scattered wetlands. I've mentioned several times how so little of the historical prairies remain in North America and our state of Texas. The extremely fertile soils that created the prairies ultimately led to the loss of the prairie and the ecosystem that goes with it. The prairie soils are excellent for row cropping and grazing livestock. This series of maps shows acreage planted by various crops during 2018 and 2019. Just to summarize these maps, you can see the majority of corn and soybean acreage is found in the Midwest states of Iowa, the Dakotas, and into Nebraska. This is the two maps on the left. In the drier areas of Texas and Oklahoma, winter wheat and cotton are grown extensively, as seen on the two maps on the right. In the middle map shows considerable hay production in Oklahoma as well. The Blackland Prairie has some of the richest soils west of the Mississippi. Before the expansion of the railroad in the 1870s and 1890s, the major use of the prairie was for livestock. This changed to farming with the railroad. The era of the Cotton Kingdom began, and it was reported that more cotton was grown on the Blackland Prairie for 70 years than any other region of the world. Along with farming and livestock production, urbanization has also been a major reason for conversion away from the prairie. Birds associated with grasslands have been hit particularly hard by declines in the prairies. Species such as northern bobwhite, meadowlark, field sparrows, loggerhead shrike, and scissor-tailed flycatchers have shown long, steady declines in breeding bird surveys. Here you can see that grassland birds are a vital part of the North American landscape, and 48 species nest in the U.S. grasslands. Of these birds, they're among the fastest and most consistently declining birds in North America. 48% are of conservation concern, and 55% are showing significant declines. To be fair, habitat loss, excuse me, may only be part of the reason for the overall decline. Herbicide use and pesticide use throughout this area has been shown to harm bird populations. A recent large-scale study that took place between 2008 and 2014 showed evidence that the class of insecticides called neonicotinoids has had negative impacts, particularly on grassland birds. This study looked at grassland birds, non-grassland birds, insectivores, and non-insectivores, and took into consideration changes in land use, agricultural crop acreage, and changes in changes in pesticide use. The study showed adverse impacts on bird populations concentrated in the Midwest, Southern California, and the Northern Great Plains, which is basically very closely associated with your high ag use areas. Several driving forces maintain the prairie ecosystem. Grazing by large herbivores and periodic fire, along with a mostly arid climate, maintained the prairie. Fire was both natural and man-caused. Periodic lightning strikes caused a mosaic across the landscape of areas with different types of vegetation and different composition. Bison preferred the younger growth grasses that would grow after a burn, and this would facilitate the movement of the herd from one area to another. Bison would graze on older growth, but not as heavily. This mosaic effect across the landscape created a diverse ecosystem. Here's a quote by Stephen Pine, who is a expert on the management of wildland fire throughout much of the continent, not just the United States, but pretty much everywhere. Here he says, the modification of the American continent by fire at the hands of indigenous people was the result of repeated controlled surface burns on a cycle of 1 to 3 years. So extensive were the cumulative effects of these modifications that it may be said that the general consequences of the Indian occupation of the New World was to replace forested land with grassland or savanna, or where the forest persisted, to open it up and free it from underbrush. Native Americans knew the importance of fire throughout many of the areas they occupied. Native Americans used fire for several reasons, such as one, creating foraging areas to attract wildlife in both prairie and forest ecosystems. Two, creating openings and maintaining openings for planting food crops. Three, driving herds to areas to be hunted. And lastly, controlling pests. And like I said, this is probably just a few of the uses that Indians saw with the importance of fire. Fire and grazing are both types of disturbance. Disturbance is important because prairies are constantly transitioning even while they appear to lay idle. During a small window of time, prairies are often invaded by woody shrubs, leading to further changes in water infiltration, herbaceous cover, and erosion. Additionally, annual wildflower and grass species production is often lost without disturbance due to a dense, matted, perennial herbaceous cover and ground litter. Furthermore, habitat suitability for many prairie-dependent wildlife species will significantly decline because they rely on disturbance to create their habitat requirements. Fire, grazing, and mechanical treatments, such as light disking and shredding, can increase plant diversity, create woody areas for upland birds and ungulates, maintain wildlife cover requirements for nesting, escape, brood, fawn, and thermal cover, produce nutritious regrowth for ungulates, enhance structural diversity, maintain or set back successional stages, increase forbs, alter insect type and abundance, prevent woody invasion, alter the distribution of ungulates, reduce the risk of wildfire, increase nutrient cycling, and microbial activity. Also, the trampling of seeds and organic material into the ground helps inoculate plants, maintains water and soil resources, improve forage characteristics for grazers, browsers, and foragers. Performed incorrectly, the aforementioned benefits can be lost or even reversed. Just a couple of results from some studies that were done in the prairie country on the importance of brush control. A study in Kansas showed that brush increased 34% from 1937 to 1969 in unburned areas, but only increased 1% in burned sites. Another study in Kansas showed a 60% increase in the number of trees in just 5 years without fire. The frequency of historical fire within prairies can be debated. Within a forest, fire regimes can somewhat be determined by fire scars and the tree rings, but due to the absence of trees in prairies, that method cannot be used. Studying tree scars in nearby savannas have been used, as well as charcoal deposits in lake beds. Timing of historical fires was dictated by ignition source, fuel moisture, and weather. Season of fire likely depended on the method. Native Americans were known to conduct burns in both the growing season and the dormant season. As for lightning strikes, most thunderstorms in the Great Plains occur from April to October, with most lightning fires occurring between May and September, especially July and August during the drier portions. Estimates of fire interval for the Great Plains range between 1 upwards of to 35 years, with the long end of the range being the northern and western edges where climate is cooler and drier. In the tallgrass prairie, estimates are 10 years or less. For our portions of Texas, estimates for fire interval are seen in this slide, with some areas in yellow burned every 1 to 3 years, the other areas near the coast every 4 to 6 years, and more inland areas 7 to 12-year intervals. When speaking of the fire intervals historically compared to today and using prescribed fire, one needs to realize that historically fire was mostly for maintenance in near pristine ecosystems. In today's system, with much of our brush, it may take a long period of burning as often as you can just to get a property on a maintenance schedule. Okay, switching gears. So far, we have discussed to some degree how prairies formed, how they evolved, how they were maintained, and their importance in the ecosystem. Much of this involved fire. So next, I will try to cover some of the basics of how to safely use fire on your property. When discussing prescribed burns, we often host half-day workshops just to cover the basics. For the remaining portion of this presentation, I will try to cover the major areas, but by no means will it be very in-depth. You will see here several of the reasons why we burn today. Brush control, thatch removal, promote forbs, promote native grasses, just trying to restore the historical fire frequency, reduce the stature of woody vegetation, and also just to mitigate fuels and to reduce the possibility of a wildfire. From this list, you will see that most correspond with the earlier slide on why fire is beneficial to prairies. So, when using prescribed fire as a wildlife habitat management tool, it is best when you use it as part of a comprehensive resource management plan and you incorporate the livestock, wildlife, water, and soil goals. It's best when it's used in conjunction with biological, chemical, and/or mechanical means to drastically alter a plant community. It's also used to maintain quality native habitat, and when you apply it at a scale and frequency to meet the management goals. So just to elaborate on a few of these points, the second point mentions incorporating various types of treatments in conjunction with fire. Many properties out there today, if you even try to burn them, particularly in your woodlands, you're going to have a hard time possibly even getting fire to run through them unless under extreme fire weather conditions, basically wildfire conditions. Because of this, some pre-treatments such as bush hogging or mulching may be needed to open up a forest floor just to get fine fuels such as grasses to grow. Also, on point number 4, it mentions the scale and the frequency. Both of these points back to what is the goal. If the goal is neotropical migrants that readily fly long distances, then a larger area with only a few scattered burns may be helpful. And I'm kind of talking on a landscape pattern. If we have one burn in part of Fayette County and the next burn is 20 miles away, that might have some help for migrants as they're coming through. But on the other hand, if you're talking managing and wanting some bobwhite quail, you're going to have to burn at a lot smaller scale to try to have any impact on quail populations since they're obviously less mobile. A successful burning program involves 3 basic steps as listed here. Number 1, thorough planning, which includes total ranch evaluation, pasture selection, management goals, training and preparation for the burn. Number 2, safe and effective execution of the burn on the specified area. And 3, sound range, livestock and wildlife management before, during, and after the burn. Uh, Number 3, if you got cattle on the place, you're obviously going to have to defer the area that you're wanting to burn ahead of time. A little bit of light grazing after the burn is probably not that big a deal. Like I said earlier, the buffalo, that's kind of what they did. But also, buffalo moved on once they did some grazing. So if you burn an area and you turn cattle loose on it afterwards, you cannot just let them camp out on it for the next 2 or 3 months. Otherwise, you're going to do more harm than good. This slide here just shows the importance of deferring grazing. Uh, it's like this picture was probably taken late summer, going into the fall, maybe. Uh, but if you're wanting to burn the area on the left, that is not happening. The property on the right, you can see, has been deferred for a while, and it's more suitable for burning. Your time of deferment is also going to be dependent somewhat on a lot on your rainfall. If it just happen to be wanting to burn next burn season, and then this summer ends up being a really heavy drought, you're going to need a longer period of deferment from the cattle. And there's always a possibility if you get such a drought, you're not going to be able to burn next year anyhow. So you just have to play that by ear. I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation that this was just going to be a very broad look at some of this of what we need to do to burn. Fire breaks is going to be the key to safely burning and to reducing as much stress as you can prior to a burn. Here's a couple of different pictures, just a sendero, an area that was actually looks like it was probably maintained with a maintainer on the bottom left, uh, and then just your typical one on the right using a disc and a tractor. Fire break should be about 2 to 3 times as wide as the expected flame length. So if you're expecting 6-foot flames, then create a break 12 to 18 feet. Uh, a combination of bare dirt and mowed area can be very effective in areas with tall grass. Mowing reduces the expected flame length. So basically, you can disc a 8 to 10 foot, 12-foot strip, and then come inside the unit and use a bush hog and mow it short, and it'll reduce that flame length right next to the fire break. Uh, just make sure when you're doing that, you're not throwing cut grass out onto the disc area. Fire breaks are the single most important aspect of conducting a safe burn. Proper fire breaks will speed up the actual burn and will reduce the amount of equipment and manpower needed the day of the burn. I would put a lot of time and effort into my fire breaks if that's something, if you're wanting to burn. I would maintain them annually. They do make good food plots, so even if it's a year you're not wanting to burn, you can still disc it up, plant some winter food plots in there. Uh, Also, just having a set of fire breaks throughout your property that are easily maintainable. Come August 1st, and you start seeing a lot of little roadside fires throughout your county. You can go in, fluff up your fire breaks, and gives you a lot more protection. Having adequate equipment is also very important for a burn. Here's pictures of some different things that are used commonly on burns. On the left is a drip torch. Uh, I hate to put stuff in order of importance, but a drip torch is very important. It allows you to put down a continuous line of fire on your backfire, head fire, whatever it may be. If you don't have a continuous line of fire on your backfire, uh, then basically when you do light your head fire, it could overrun that fire break. So drip torches are really important. Weather kits come in different forms. Commonly, we use just what we call a kestrel unit, which is on the top right, measures wind speed, relative humidities, a couple of different other variables, temperature, stuff of that nature. Radios are important, for obvious reasons, so you can communicate with other people on the crew, whether you're burning a 2 acre unit or a 100 acre unit. You know, it, you don't need to be hollering and trying to get people's attention. So obviously, radios are way to go. For fuel, diesel and gas, and this drip torch, for the most part, you're going to use uh, 2/3 diesel, 1/3 gas, or upwards of 3/4 diesel, 1/4 gas. Uh, you definitely want to err on the diesel side if you're going to mess up. You want to have more diesel than gas rather than way too much gas. Hand tools such as flappers and rakes come in handy. Uh, and basically, flappers is, even though they're called flappers, you really just smother fire out by uh, pushing it into the ground and taking the oxygen away from the grass you're burning. Water sprayers are good. They can come in different forms, whether it's just your standard ATV herbicide type sprayer as pictured here, or a more in-depth one as on the back of this trailer here. I would just say the more often you burn, probably the better water system I would have. As you're increasing risk, it just makes sense to kind of upgrade your equipment. And then clothing, I'm gonna go, goggles, gloves, boots, cotton clothing are all suitable. And once again, if you burn a lot and you're increasing your risk, then Nomex, you know, suits or pants or shirt are good. They are going to be quite expensive, but they do help protect you. Kind of closing out this presentation, here's some of the topics that we just did not cover tonight. As I mentioned earlier, when we do burn workshops, they normally last 4 to 6 hours, and we go into a lot more depth on a lot of this. Weather alone, you can take a 3 or 4 day class, S290. Just you almost become a weatherman by the time you're finished with this. The techniques on burning, where we discuss a lot more, uh, backfire, head fire, flanking fire, strip fires, and how you go about burning your piece of property or your unit. Also, prescriptions and the burn plan. We didn't really cover any of that. Uh, what if you're wanting to set back the brush in your prairie system? What do you need to shoot for? What temperatures? What RH? Um, how strong a wind? Of course, that your prescription and your burn plan kind of go hand in hand. Smoke management, we did not cover either. A lot of people, when they think of fire, they're mainly thinking about the flame. What happens if the flame jumps my fence, goes onto my neighbor's property? burn up part of their hay pasture, or worse, burn up a barn or something of that nature. That's important, but smoke management is equally important. Uh, once the flame is out and you still have a lot of smoke that may linger on after the burn, or if you're burning in a wooded area that may burn for or smolder and smoke for days. If you're right next to a highway, or even if you're not right next to it, but if your smoke crosses a highway and you cause an accident, uh, you're going to be held liable for that. So it's important that you follow your prescription. It's well thought out. That definitely helps. If something was to go wrong, you can at least show that you followed a well thought out plan, and you didn't just go out there haphazardly and throw a match on the ground and hope for the best. All right, last slide. Like I said, I just covered a few things, covered some equipment, some techniques, just a little bit, fire breaks. I threw out different things. If it did overwhelm you in any way, or even if it didn't overwhelm you, uh, you do have a burn association that covers your area. This part of Texas, South Central Texas Prescribed Burn Association. Many of the officers with this Native Prairie Chapter are also the officers for this Prescribed Burn Association. The beauty with the Prescribed Burn Association is a lot of this equipment I listed. They have a lot of it on hand. Uh, Also, as so your Prescribed Burn Association, probably your two of your bigger benefits is the equipment and manpower. So basically, you're working as a cooperative with other landowners. Uh, they need help burning. You go help them burn, and when you need help burning, hopefully others will show up to your place. So you got good access to manpower and equipment and training and expertise. So I encourage you to join South Central Texas Prescribed Burn Association, and here's their website. And with that, thank y'all for tuning in.